Welcome back to Majority Rules. I'm Lauren Leader, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, which we've been trying to schedule for a while because I am like a super fan, and I've been wanting to talk to the amazing Aviva Klompus for a very long time. And the timing of our conversation actually feels really important in a lot of ways. Obviously, the first presidential debate, the ongoing questions about whether or not Hamas is ever going to accept a ceasefire agreement, the recent release of not release, let me resay that, the recent freeing of three hostages by the IDF and the ongoing conflicts, the impending visit of Netanyahu to the United States. There's so much to talk about. I think we're at day, 258 of the hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. And I have come to rely on the social media, on Twitter especially, of Aviva Klompus, who I'm so happy is here. She's the co-founder of an organization called Boundless, which she'll tell us a little bit more about. She tweets, if you don't already follow her, because I feel like everyone does, including, by the way, some of my friends and staff in Israel who said that your stuff comes across their feed all the time. You're everywhere these days. It's such an important voice. She tweets at Aviva Klompus with a K, Klompas. And she's my guest today. Aviva, thanks for coming to Majority Rules. Thank you so much for being here. I have been dying to talk to you.
It is my pleasure, and thank you. That was a very warm and kind introduction.
So, all right. So, did you have 323,000 Twitter followers before October 7th? I'm guessing you did not.
Not even close.
So
it was about 70,000.
Okay, which is still significant, but still, can you just, from a purely communicate, because we're going to get into the issues in a real way, but I'm just curious about how it happened that you became such a sort of go-to voice on what's happening in Israel and Gaza, on anti-Semitism, on sort of calling out the media in their many times that they've gotten it wrong. Did you really make a conscious decision that you wanted to use your social platform on these issues after October 7th, or did it sort of happen because you were posting important stuff and it just sort of people wanted to hear what you had to say? I was really curious about it, kind of how it all happened.
The story goes back quite a lot farther than October 7th. I used to be the speechwriter for the Israeli delegation to the United Nations. And that's when I joined Twitter, which is about 10 years ago now. And I actually remember at the time, colleagues had to convince me. I thought, I don't think anybody needs to hear what I have to say. It's silly. And they said to me, no, this is a public forum. This is, as Elon Musk would say, the town square. This is where conversation and debate happens, where politicians and journalists and diplomats are having a discourse, and you really want to be a part of it. And part of the way that I interact and communicate with the world is very much grounded in my experience working for Israel at the UN. Now, it's no secret that the United Nations has not been a good friend to Israel, and that's a real understatement.
Serious understatement.
Notorious for its bias against Israel. And the one question people always used to ask me is, so why does Israel belong to the UN? Nobody has to belong to the United Nations. It's voluntary membership. And more than that, you actually have to pay to be a member in good standing of the United Nations. So Israel is actually paying dues to endure the sort of horrific bias, demonization, delegitimization that we see actually on a daily basis. And it's institutionalized bias. And while I got asked that question all the time, that was never, not once, a point of discussion inside of the delegation, because it never occurred to us for a moment that Israel has anything less than every right to participate in and contribute to global affairs. Israel has a right to be treated equally and fairly among the family of nations. And that's the mentality that I adopt. And I've actually always had that mentality. It's just been in hyper mode since October 7th. So basically what happens on social media is I see something and I say, well, that's not going to be the last word on that because that's not accurate. So the first thing is I'm not tolerating anybody that speaks as though what happened on October 7th is due to Israel, or that the anti-Semitism that we've seen, that the Jewish people are deserving of this. We are not, and I'm going to call it out every time. The notion that there are young Jews, and there are new studies that are coming out showing that young Jews are afraid to identify. They're taking off their kippah, they're tucking in their Star of David that they wear. They're scared. And the notion that we live in the United States of America, in an age of identity politics, when you're encouraged to identify as whomever you want, that the one thing you can't safely identify is Jewish, well, that's BS, and I'm going to call
God
that out.
forbid you should say you're a Zionist.
Moreover, exactly. And then the third thing is I'm sick to death of people that will speak with great sympathy about dead Jews, but won't take any meaningful action to safeguard the actual living Jews right here. And they're going to get called out every time also. That's a lot of calling out because there's a lot to call out. And I think that is really why there's been so much material and that my platform has grown.
All right. So let's get into it for a second, because I think that like for so many of us, most American Jews were raised in a world, in this post-Holocaust world, of constant awareness of our minority status and of our history of persecution, right? Like that is what it is to be Jewish anywhere in the diaspora, right? Is, they tried to kill us, they didn't succeed, let's eat. That's pretty much American Judaism right there, wherever you fall on the religious spectrum, right? And so there is this weird tension that I think so many American Jews have been feeling since October 7th, which is that we always knew the anti-Semitism was there. Nobody questioned that. We knew that the world was anti-Semitic, that the world hates Jews, and it doesn't go away. And yet there's still this like perpetual shock at the overt nature of the anti-Semitism right now. What is essentially these rolling pogroms that have basically been happening in LA, in, the New York subways, like pick a spot. How do you think about, how old are you? You look like you're younger than me. So I think like there's some generational pieces in here too. But I mean, I just think that like there is this tension that so many of us have been struggling with, of like, I can't believe this is happening. I believe this is happening. I knew this could happen. My grandparents told me this could happen. My parents told me this could happen. And yet, how could we be here?
Yeah, there's no question that it's baked into sort of the DNA of the Jewish people. And it goes right back to the notion of the Exodus story from our earliest days as a people, and the whole history of what Jewish communities have suffered when they haven't had the autonomy, when they haven't had a state of their own. And so while we live very comfortably here in the United States and enjoy enormous benefits and privileges, there's a piece of us that always feels a sense of discomfort that I don't think has ever truly gone away. But at the same time, we've been embraced by the United States and we feel very welcome here and we're grateful for what's happening in the United States. And I think that leads to the dichotomy that you're sort of pointing out, which is we've always kind of held our breaths waiting for this moment. But in actuality of what we've seen, I mean, it took Israel about 3 weeks before they actually launched a ground invasion of Gaza. So there was this 3 weeks where it was just Israel that had been under attack and was preparing, and 250 hostages had been taken. We didn't know the death toll for weeks because the sheer scale of the casualties. So before Israel even retaliated, you had people on the streets chanting, "Gas the Jews." And so that's, I think, when the other shoe drops, that says that there's inherent hatred that's just been festering and breeding and exploded after October 7th.
I think the campus stuff also, like, is so shocking and horror and devastating in so many ways. I saw a hint of this. A friend of mine's daughter who went to Columbia actually and had a Palestinian roommate, and her brother was invited to go play sports, professional sports in Israel, and it created this huge rift in their family because she, believed that Israel was the terrible occupier and he was going off to this evil empire. And it was so shocking to me because I'd never had any sense that there were young people who saw Israel that way. And then, of course, it, metastasized on campuses in the way that now everyone understands. Do you have a sense of why and how, particularly, and, there is a strain of like young, unaffiliated Jews who also are part of this, we're part of these campus encampments and, have been part of some of the like ultra left wing, anti-Israel stuff. Do you have a sense of where that came from? Is it to you like they never went to Israel? They're just so loosely affiliated with their identity that they don't know? Like, what do you think? Were they really have they been indoctrinated on campuses by radical elements? Like, how do you explain, how this happened.
So the organization that I co-founded, Boundless, it's a think action tank. This is one of the issues that we look at. And the truth is, what we're seeing is a generational long disinformation campaign that actually stretches all the way back to the Cold War, when you had the Soviet Union versus the United States. And when Israel was first founded, both the Soviet Union and the United States voted in favor of this country. But essentially what happens is the rift begins to grow. And as Israel becomes more capitalist in nature and open in Western democracy, it begins to align itself with the United States. And that leaves the Soviet Union with no choice but to align itself more with the Arab nations in the region. And the idea is you never want to fight a war on your own territory. Ideally, you want to fight it quite far away. So the Middle East becomes the front in the Cold War. And in order to undermine Israel, which is another way of saying this American outpost, this perceived American outpost in the West,
interesting.
The Soviets begin this massive disinformation campaign. And essentially they say, this is going to sound very familiar because it's the same strategy, just new tactics of spreading it more quickly on social media. But Israel is, the Jewish people have no connection to their historic land. So they try to paint us as colonizers or as oppressors. And they disregard our history all the way back to biblical times, and that there's been a continued Jewish presence in the area that is the land of Israel until today. They paint Israel as the aggressors. They paint the Palestinians as a people without agency. They never speak about all of the peace agreements that Israel has offered up over time. And so this is sort of the narrative that takes hold. And because it's painted in very anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist rhetoric, it finds a foothold in academic circles in the United States and essentially becomes very popular. And that's two generations of academics that have taught two generations of young people. And now we're seeing the product of that on campuses across the United States and really across the world.
But I don't think any of us had any idea. Most of us had no idea that any of that was going on. I mean, I think that's what's so weird about it. It was like maybe under our noses, but like somehow had no idea that this was like as rampant as it was. And I do think that obviously there's been, as you say, we all understand the way in which social media can like take a germ of something and it catches fire. And obviously there have been lots of forces pushing disinformation, in the last, since October 7th, which maybe a lot of these kids who clearly had no idea anything about this until, they were sort of pulled into stuff on campus. But yeah, I mean, it's like it was under our noses all this time. And maybe you knew, I didn't know, nobody else I know had any idea that any of this was going on.
It's been a rude awakening, and I don't think that people fully comprehend just how dangerous it is. Because this is, it's about Israel, but it's not really about Israel. Ultimately, it's about Iran. They're the backers of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and all these terrorist organizations that are attacking Israel in the Middle East. And Iran very clearly will say that Israel is the little Satan, and the big Satan, of course, is the United States.
The United States.
And since October 7th, it's Iran that's watching very closely, not just how Israel responds, but actually how America and the European Western nations will respond to what's going on. How far can they push it? And it's not just Iran. So Russia is watching as it's considering its next moves in Ukraine. China is watching as it's considering what it's going to do about Taiwan. And Iran has already successfully destabilized Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and it's thinking about how much further it can push. And the message that particularly young people on campus have been sending is that we don't have a tolerance, that it doesn't matter that 45 Americans were murdered on October 7th. It doesn't matter that 5 Americans are currently being held hostage in Gaza. It's been 265 days. We aren't showing them that this is absolutely intolerable. And what that's doing is it is making this world infinitely more dangerous in this fight against tyrants. And what these young people on campuses, they are telegraphing a message, not just that we don't have the stomach for the war on terror, but they are telling our enemies how to win the narrative war. That all that they have to do to win is to claim that it is quote unquote resistance, right? And then all of a sudden everything's on the table. Murder, assault, terrorism, so on.
I mean, it really does. I was thinking as you were talking about the Russian interference in the 2016 election and the sort of the theory of change being that a divided America is a weak America, right? And that the Russian trolls that, were exploiting the weaknesses in social media in the lead up to that 2016 election. Like, we know now that was part of their strategy, was exploit the weaknesses that are already there in American society, right? Create a kind of conditions of, increased strife, increased division, and then it renders America weaker, which seems to be the continuing strategy, right? I mean, and then I keep thinking too, for those
Absolutely.
of us who lived through those of us who were adults in 9/11, like, to imagine a world, which of course, like, we read about 9/11 sitting in Central Park looking at the New York Times the next day. I saw 9/11 with my own eyes, like, but there was no social media. And there was clearly controversy. There were, Fahrenheit 9/11 things, efforts to, like, sort of blame Bush in a way for some of the conditions, blame Americans for the conditions that led. But the vast majority of Americans, and really the whole world, was so united in the horror of the attack, right? That there's no justification for this kind of, appalling act. And yet, like, we can't get anywhere near that with October 7th.
That's right. The World Economic Forum puts out a report every year where they identify what the greatest threats are to global peace and security in the short term, in 2 years, and the long term, 10 years. This year, for the very first time, they put on the list misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And that's one of the greatest threats in the short term. And it's no surprise, because you have an enormous amount of countries that are going to the elections, to polls this year. And as you're saying about our impending election, is that there is a lot at stake here in terms of the values that we're going to uphold. And that's actually the war that's taking place. There is this big misinformation, disinformation campaign that's taking place under the surface, and people really aren't paying attention because they don't realize the stakes for American democracy.
And we haven't really been educated in how to we still haven't really helped people understand, how to read what's disinformation. And by the way, like, we got to talk about some of the disinformation that's also come out of what are supposedly some of our most respected news sources in the last, since October, right? I mean, the New York Times running a headline that Israel was responsible for for bombing the Al-Shifa hospital. Like, that was untrue. And the news outlets continue to report casualty numbers relatively unchecked by the Gazan health ministry, which is Hamas. And, even this week, when Jamal Bowman loses his race in New York to George Latimer in a district that voted overwhelmingly for George, because they knew him for years. I know him for years. He's a staunch supporter of the community, not just of Israel. The New York Times runs a headline which says, race flooded with Jewish money. It's everywhere. It's in the mainstream now as well. And it's interesting because I met recently with Cindy McCain. She came to speak at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I asked her about this question about how real is the famine? How do we know? Because there is real question about whether or not the information coming out of Gaza is correct or fair. So how do you parse your sources? Because you've actually been somebody who has, like, routinely called out disinformation, but, like, it's not easy. So how do you manage that? And, like, what should people be wary of in this really, crazy time? I mean, I feel for sure, like, as soon as I think a lot of Jewish Americans, certainly when we hear Gazan health ministry, we're like, out. That's it. Like, we know it's unreliable. But, we might not have known that 6 months ago.
Right. It's not so much how do I do it? It's the question, I think, is why has everybody else suspended critical thinking? How is it that when you see an attack that you've decided on what the headline is going to be before there's any sort of investigation, and certainly a third-party investigation, rather than listening to the terrorists that have actually ruined the place? Or why is it that the famine was proven to be incorrect? There was a new report that came out just this week. It's from the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, and it found that essentially the United Nations wasn't counting all the trucks that went into Gaza. If they were being sent in by a private corporation, they weren't counting it. So they were only partially counting the trucks as they're assessing whether or not there's a famine. And if you go to UNRWA's Twitter page right now, you'll find that the pinned tweet is about the famine in Gaza. So even when these things get proven to be untrue, nobody's going and correcting the record. Nobody's holding news agencies to account for these screaming headlines that accuse Israel of horrific things. and then it gets disproven a day or two later when the truth comes to light. And really, we should be demanding more of these news agencies. We should be canceling our subscriptions, writing to the editor, tweeting about it, or posting about it on whatever social media platform, and refusing to accept this as normal.
But the problem is, Aviva, it's like there's nothing left. Like, where then are I mean, I think that's what makes this so difficult. It's like, where are then the reliable sources? I mean, we had just last week, we had Jessica Yellen on, and Jessica Yellen runs an extraordinarily well run it's called News Not Noise. I'm sure you've followed it. It's outstanding, and she does an incredible job of making sure that everything that gets reported is accurate and is based on the most current information. And where there is not a clear picture and we don't know an answer yet, she's very clear about that. We need a lot more of that. But boy, like when the New York Times becomes, for those of us who've spent a lifetime, kind of fact checking all the stuff online against sources like the New York Times or the Journal or the Washington Post, if they're not getting it right, you really feel like you're sort of out in a boat without an oar. I don't know what the expression is, but rudderless. Let me see if I can come up with some more analogies, but it feels very
Nautical
unnerving.
analogies. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's
nautical
worse than
analogies.
that. You have an AP photojournalist getting an award for taking that horrific picture of the contorted body of Shani Look in the back of a pickup truck. You have the AP not the AP, you have Al Jazeera screaming about journalists being injured in Gaza when it turns out that one of them was actually holding hostages. I mean, the ways that the news media has failed us and failed to call out their own is really shameful.
So can we talk too about some of the justifications that I know you battle all the time online? I am really still trying to process a couple things. One is the number of people who justified the violence outside of the synagogue in LA last week because there was there was an organization there to sell real estate opportunities to Jews who might think about making Aliyah or buying real estate there to support the country. There was all this disinformation about it somehow selling settlements in the West Bank, which turned out to be false. But the fact that people think that that's an acceptable rationale, right? Like, oh, we had a reason. Like, it's fine. We're going to go protest the synagogue because of X. We're going to go assault a rabbi because of X. Like, that's rampant. And then the other piece is like the Jamal Bowman race, which has made me insane because I live right there. I know everyone involved very, very well. Jamal Bowman fired himself. He did a terrible job and he had no support in the community long before AIPAC came along. But the narrative that this sort of nefarious narrative, and fair enough that AIPAC is a complicated organization. They definitely support a lot of folks way to the right of me that I am not comfortable with. But at the end of the day, it's just been this constant refrain of blame, it's the Jews' fault for, their race. This was racist. They were calling George Latimer racist. I saw texts where they genocide George, because he supports the Jewish community in Westchester, which by the way, it's a huge Jewish community. So where do you even begin with this stuff? Because I feel like every time I see it online, it's whack-a-mole, right? Like you see one, you call it out. I feel that way on abortion rights too. Like I call out stuff all the time, but it's just never ending. So is your feeling like you just never stop fighting? You just never stop? Or is there some point at which there's just it's like a finger in the dike and there's just things that you're not going to be able to combat? I don't know. It's almost like an emotional question too, around how you keep doing it every day, how all of us keep doing it every day when it feels like such a waterfall of craziness all the time.
Endless. Yeah. The people are absolutely being blinded by hatred. And that's the simple truth of it. Because if we would take any of the instances that you pointed out and replace Jews with a different minority community, like Hispanics, LGBTQ, whatever it is, people wouldn't for a moment think that it was acceptable to go and protest outside a house of worship. They wouldn't for a moment think that it was acceptable, like Jamal Bowman did, to deny the rape of women in that community. So essentially what we're seeing is, again, people suspending normal, rational thinking and their critical thinking skills because they're blinded by hatred. People that want to oppose the war or are concerned about civilians in Gaza being killed, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And a reasonable person can figure out how to make that claim, to oppose a war, to voice a concern about innocent civilians without calling for the destruction of a state, the genocide of the Jewish people, without calling for the death of Jews, without harassing and intimidating Jews outside of their house of worship. Any reasonable person, if they stop for a moment, can figure out how to make that distinction. You don't need a PhD, you don't need to run a think action tank to be able to do that. And the question is, why are people not doing it? So on a personal level, yes, I feel compelled to call it out every time. I actually don't find it exhausting. I actually find that it's incredibly important. And so I continue to do it. But then again, from the perspective boundless, what we're trying to figure out is how are we going to explain to communities that it's absolutely unacceptable to go and to protest outside of a house of worship, a Jewish community center, a Jewish-owned business, that there are other places you want to protest, you need to go and find outside of the Israeli embassy. That would be acceptable. What are the words that you should be using? Well, they're certainly not calling for genocide. And what does that mean? And so forth. So that actually has just become my life's mission to do this work.
Well, it's amazing. And I think you've really inspired a lot of us to try to do it with you in any place that we can. And you've had just like a really extraordinary level of influence, I think, in a very short period of time and in a very like productive way that I'm grateful for. Mike, another person who's been doing similar work, Dan Senior, who's been doing, his amazing podcasts, and he's amazing. And actually, we're gonna have him with us at 2A, I hope soon, because he's also, I actually think we should have you both together. We need to get you guys together. But yeah, it's overwhelming. I did want to just before we wrap ask you.
Can I say a word about Dan?
Please.
So Dan actually, I just wrote a book. It's coming out very soon. It's called Stand Up Nation. Dan's book is called Startup Nation. So it's a riff off of his. And he actually wrote an endorsement for my book. So I would like nothing more than to do something.
Is it available yet on Amazon? Is your book on Amazon yet?
As of today, it's on Barnes & Noble, and it should be on Amazon within a few days.
That's amazing. I can't wait to read it. So can we talk for a minute about the hostages and about the tensions inside Israel about this? The latest is that Hamas has rejected yet another ceasefire. There was a lot of question about whether or not Netanyahu was going to accept it. He's sort of vacillated. The families in Israel are rightfully apoplectic. It's just unconscionable that these families, that these children, that these women and girls, that any of these Israelis are still being held. God only knows where they are, how many are still alive, etc. But what happens now? Like, what happens if Hamas continues to reject these ceasefires? Like, what's your sense of where we are on this? Both from is there any circumstances that gets Hamas to accept some sort of ceasefire? And then on the other side, is there any world in which Netanyahu calls for elections and actually steps aside to allow, he's so weak. He has such poor support. He had poor support in Israel before October 7th. They were in the streets every day before October 7th. Now it's just, this is like he's holding it together with Band-Aids. So what's your sense of those two ends of the spectrum?
In terms of the hostages, it's unbearable to think about it's about 120 people estimated to be there. The estimates are that probably about a third of them are no longer alive, at least minimally. And it's devastating to think what they've endured after 265 days. We saw the nature of the brutality on October 7th, and there's every reason to believe they've been enduring that level of brutality, particularly what we've heard from the hostages that have either been rescued or freed in the deal back in November. The challenge with the hostages comes back to this notion that the West is not playing its part. There's a lot to say about the players involved, about the Netanyahu government and about Hamas and these two leaderships. But ultimately, we have sent the message that it is somehow acceptable to take hundreds of people hostage, many of them, most of them are civilians ripped from their home, and to hold them like this without access to the Red Cross, with no information about them for 265 horrifying days.
Hold on, Aviva, because who's the we? Because I think that's a very impact incendiary thing to say in a way. And I want to just take a second because what I see is certainly the administration, and you can argue about whether, we could argue about Biden and his standing all day long, but you've had Blinken, in the region day after day after day, working with every potential partner in the region to try to mediate to Hamas, et cetera. I don't feel that I would never say that I feel that they've been, made it acceptable. There's certainly not been as much attention on the hostages in the West as I think there should be. So what do you mean by that?
So that's it. I commend the Biden administration because they have spoken about it frequently. They've met with the hostage families a lot. And you're right, Blinken has been in the Middle East quite a bit. But there's a lot of things that aren't being done. First of all, how many Americans can name the 5 Americans that are being held hostage?
No one.
Nobody can.
No one.
In 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, people had yellow ribbons tied all over every tree post and business. It was personal to the American people, and they were part of the campaign to bring them home. Now, the American people here are not campaigning to bring home the 5 Americans, never mind the 120 in total. And what I'm saying is that the terrorists are watching this lack of will and this lack of determination, not just from the United States, but from Western nations that are in some ways tolerating what has been going on for 265 days. Western nations could have banded together and told Qatar, either you expel those Hamas leaders that are living like kings in your border, or we're done. There's no more economic, there's no more diplomatic ties between us. There are much more strident steps that could be taken, but we're not. For some reason, we are negotiating with terrorists, and it's outrageous.
Yeah, which we would not do under any other circumstances and have refused to do for the last 50 years. I think it's a really interesting, really important point. And so the last one before we go, on the Israeli side, on Netanyahu and his hanger-onerness. He's so weak. He has so little support inside the country. It's hard to understand how he's still there. What is your sense about what happens? Does he just hang on and hang on and hang on?
Certainly, the Israeli people know about elections. We elected it where he was. I'm not American. I'm not Israeli, but he was elected. There were 5 elections in 4 years. They know a thing or two about running elections, and he came out on top. And it's not unlike the situation we're facing in the United States that a lot of people feel like you're going to have to live with something. But thank God we have a system in place that actually gives them a term limit. The second thing that I'll say is that what we've seen since October 7th and the way that the Israeli people have risen up to take care of one another, to serve their country, to fight this terrorist organization has been nothing less than magnificent, and they deserve the very best. And I really hope that in the next election, whenever it may be, that they will get the very best of what they deserve.
Mm-hmm. That's a lovely way of putting it. All right, so in our last minute, Aviva, give us the what do we do? If you could tell, any American, any person watching 1, 2 things that they can do to help support, make sure we're not amplifying disinformation, that we are being truthful in the way that we talk about this very complicated situation, how we fight back against the rampant anti-Semitism in our midst.
Yeah.
Give us your best advice.
Here's the one thing that I want people to know. So Boundless, my organization, we did some polling. We found 66% of Americans do not know what Zionism means. 2/3 of the American public don't know what the word means. And there's a lot of people out there in the street protesting Zionism, even though I'm quite confident they don't know what it means either. Zionism is the idea that the Jewish people are entitled to a state of their own, that they should have self-determination and security. And the reason we need that is both from a simple look at history and a simple look at the dynamics of the Middle East. We got a glimpse on October 7th of what would happen to Israel if the terrorists were successful in being able to take all the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. And so the first thing that I need people to do is to actually be educated, because in the absence of actually knowing what Zionism is, they are defining it as the worst qualities in humanity. And that's not the case. You can be a Zionist and you can be a progressive, you can be a liberal, you can be a conservative and a Zionist, you can be a Zionist and believe in a Palestinian state. And that's the message that I want to leave people with, is that fight for the end of the war, but fight for the freedom of the hostages and fight for the security, the safety, and the self-determination of all the people in the region.
It's amazing. I'm thinking of my great-grandmother who spent all of the last years of her life digging in the soil of Israel to build a kibbutz and to help invest in the establishment of the state of Israel, and how lucky I am to be a beneficiary of her labor and all of those who came before us who enabled our lives in the way that they are today, and relative safety and security here in the United States and in Israel, in our own homeland. So, Aviva, like, what an honor! I learned so much. Thank you. Will you come back? Let's do another one of these with
Absolutely.
Dan. I
I
hope
would
you'll
love
come
it.
back. And for those of you that are watching Majority of Rules on an ongoing basis, our next guest is going to be the Reverend Al Sharpton. He will be my first male guest. So how about that? It's also one of my favorite people. And I think we're going to do a How do Blacks and Jews understand the world together? But he's a wonderful friend and a brilliant mind and one of the most important civil rights leaders of our time. So I'm excited to have him. And I hope you will all continue to follow Aviva and her brilliance on the socials. I'm Lauren Leader. This is Majority Rules. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you soon.